introducing Dr. Karen Strier, our speaker today. So Karen is a professor of anthropology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she did her college degree in Swarthmore College. For those of you who are not from the US, Swarthmore is one of the most prestigious liberal arts colleges. I tried to entice my two older sons to consider Swarthmore, but they didn't. But I wish, if in my next life, I hope I can get that kind of college education. And from Swarthmore, he went on to doing a master's and a PhD at Harvard University. And once she completed her PhD, she studied at University of Wisconsin in Madison. It was during her PhD that she actually launched the field project that she will be presenting to us today, focused on the Muriqis, the northern Muriqui. We didn't know that there was a southern and a northern Muriqui back then. So it means that you do the math, but since the project was started in 1982, whatever way your math comes out, it's been a long time, a very, very long time, impressive time, that she has been continually studying this group that she started following in 1988, which then, as she will tell us, grew exponentially efficient into a couple of other groups. And of the things I was trying to select, how does one select fairly something to share about your speaker when there are so many accolades that you can comment on? Definitely, I want to mention that Karen was admitted to the National Academy of Sciences 15 years ago. She has more than 100 papers, many of them focusing on the Muriqis, but on other topics as well. She's published 2 single author books, and I'll come back to one of those because there's a personal story to me for one of them. One of the 2 books is the Primate Behavioral Ecology textbook that I'm sure many of you know. And she was telling me that the 6th edition is getting published next spring. I lost track of how many co-authored edited books she's edited. And then the other single author book, that was the first time that I reviewed a book. So I reviewed Faces in the Forest back in 1992 when I was still a grad student. So that's how I really started learning about Karen's research. And her research, going onto the content of today's presentation, I imagine she's really cut across behavioral ecology, life history, population biology. And through her research on Muriqis, we have learned a lot about the value of intra-specific variation. And I understand that's going to be one of the main themes in today's presentation. I think this is a fantastic opportunity. I was reading the papers and finding again contribution to a current theme through the series, through the FIND series, which again speaks about the importance to have good quality data and the importance of acknowledging variation in everything we do. So let me see if I forgot anything that I'm going to regret not saying later. There are many, many things I could continue listing, but I think I've done. Oh, yes. See, I was forgetting this. She's the current president of the International Primatological Society. So she's been the president since 2016. And so lots of awards and everything you can imagine you'll find in Karen's CV. So with that, I'd rather stop and welcome Karen and invite you please to, I'm going to make you, I think I made you
already did that, yeah.
Okay, so you can now share your screen and hope for the best that our technology, we tried it, right? We did our homework, we met early and everything worked.
Just have to get it up here. Can you see this, everybody?
There you go.
Okay.
See?
All right,
Practice does help.
All right. Thank you, Eduardo. That was a really, really thoughtful introduction. And I'm glad that so many of you could come, even though there was this time confusion. It's really, we were talking earlier about how nice it is to be able to have excuses to give talks so we can see our own slides and think about the monkeys that we would really wish that we could be in the forest with right now, instead of having to do this long distance. And as Eduardo said, I am going to talk mostly about the Muriqis, but I want to, have to figure out how to advance this here, how to address 2 questions, and I can, tell you in advance, one of them I still haven't figured out how to answer. And so when I saw some of the people who were lined up to give talks in this series, and when I attended some of the talks and saw some of the participants, I thought, what a great opportunity to get you guys to think with me about some of the things that have been bothering me for nearly 40 years in this project. And the first one is, how do we reconcile these behavioral adaptations? You know, we come into this field thinking about social evolution and behaviors that are selected over evolutionary time. But how do we reconcile that with the high levels of flexibility that we see, whether we're looking at populations across space or in response to rapidly changing conditions over evolutionary time? Eduardo, could you mute everybody, please? Because I can hear a lot of other background. Thanks, everyone but me. Okay, so this is, I think, a really important question. The second one that
Karen, you're muted.
I just unmuted, but now you can hear me now, I think. So why the second part is why this is important for conservation. And it is, I'm thinking about this in terms of management, both in situ and ex situ. And this is also something of an evolution in my own thinking, as I have worked with one of the world's most critically endangered primates, which are the northern Muriqis. And I know some of you have heard some parts of this talk before, but there are some new pieces. It's just hard to tell the story without giving the background. So I wanted to be sure to do that. And one of the features of this is to put the Muriqis into perspective, which is that they're endemic to the Atlantic forest of Brazil, which has been subject to severe deforestation. It's completely separate from the Amazon, and there is less than 10% of the original forest remaining. Oops. I am having trouble advancing, sorry. Let's see. Eduardo, oh, here we go. There we go, okay. So in the whole region of Brazil, this region has been severely deforested, and you drive out of any major city, once you get outside the city, this is a lot of what the landscape looks like. And it's also the case that when I went to Brazil for the first time in 1982, deforestation was going on, while even at that time, even though at the time it was still considered illegal, and has remained so as well. And this is part of the Atlantic forest that was still being cleared. My field site is a privately owned forest. At the time, it was just a patch of forest of less than 1,000 hectares that the owner had decided to protect, basically to provide water and shade and building materials, but also to protect his coffee plantations. And I always like to mention him, Senor Feliciano Miguel Abdallah, because I think that he is an example of, you know, we think about what can we do, the world is so messed up, and that there can be, you know, one person who decided to save this forest ended up saving some of the world's most endangered fauna. When he died, his family turned the reserve into it's now a privately owned, federally protected reserve. And that is means that you basically can't take a branch out of, or a leaf out of the forest without permission legally. So this is a really good sign, and it gives us a lot of hope for the future of the forest. There are 4 species of primates inhabiting this forest. And I like to say this for the students, Eduardo alluded to this, but 3 of these species have had their taxonomic names changed over time. And I think that this is worth mentioning, because when we think about like consulting the literature and you look for certain species, you know, many primates have undergone taxonomic revisions in the last 20 years or so. And what that means is you may think there's nothing written about a species, but actually there's been quite extensive information about it. My research has been focusing on what used to be a monotypic genus is now called the northern Muriqian, thanks to work conducted in Tony DeFiore's lab by him and Paula Chavez, and with samples provided by a lot of other people, including myself, we have the genetic separation between these two species is about 2 million years ago, which, to put in perspective, is very close to the genetic separation between chimpanzees and bonobos. So to keep in mind that it's sort of amazing that we didn't really have two separate species of Muriqis until very recently, and yet they're that distantly related, at least genetically. This is the distribution, and for such a critically endangered species, you can see that there are real boundaries in terms of isolated. We know every single forest that both species occur in. The northern Muriqis are the red dots up here. There are 15 populations, and some of these are metapopulations, so there's actually only 12 populations or metapopulations, and the one I'll be talking about is number 8, which we talk about as the Caratinga Reserve, even though it's named after the owner. So I also want you to keep in mind that there are, of these 12 populations, there are small ones, which, and I mean small, fewer than 10 individuals. They're isolated from others. They're basically not viable without intense and immediate management. There are medium populations, which might have fewer than 50 individuals that are also isolated. And these are problematic because there's a single group in them. And so animals, if they stay in the group, have very high inbreeding. These also need management. And there are 3 or 4 large populations, and large is not that large. It's a few hundred individuals at most. But what has helped these populations is that there's more than one group, and so at least there can be dispersal between them. And so these are in some ways our most important conservation priorities because they're the most viable, but they're also the ones that don't need immediate management compared to some of the others. So when I first went to Brazil in 1982, my interest was less about the conservation side. We knew they were endangered, but I was thinking, like most PhD students, about the scientific questions. And at that time, these came out of the perspective of looking at behavioral ecology and how ecological conditions influence animal behavior, and looking at the ways in which ecological variables affect female behavior, which as females as resources to males, and how these feed back into each other. And in 1980, when I started graduate school, this model had been sort of configured by Richard Wrangham. It had already been done in bats, like we were speaking earlier, and ungulates and other organisms, into kind of a very simple, simple way of testing, looking at different kinds of food distributions relative to social organization. And the Muriqis were great models because although we knew almost nothing about their social behavior, we did know something from their morphological characteristics from museum specimens, that they had a suspensory mode of locomotion, which would allow them to travel rapidly between widely dispersed fruit resources. And they also had the dentition and jaw structure that would allow them to eat a lot of abundant leaves. So they were like a great test. Either they're frugivores or they're folivores, and then we could generate this whole set of predictions about their social behavior based on the distribution and availability of these resources. You know, the perfect PhD project. But when I went to Brazil, we also knew that I was going to a place that was a small forest fragment that had been disturbed. And something that was very prevalent in my mind at that time was how to reconcile the fact that I was asking evolutionary questions in an environment that we knew had been altered. And even here you can see in the background that there's barren hillsides and pastures and regenerating habitats. And, you know, this is something that I think was very clear from the start. Was I looking at evolutionary adaptations, or was I looking at what these animals were doing under these particular conditions? But I think it's really important to remember, this is a pretty recent photo. You can see again in the background, the barren hillsides. But then I came across this picture. I was actually looking for slides for another talk of Jane Goodall when she first arrived in East Africa at Gombe. And again, you know, the landscape is almost identical. And I think it's a good reminder that most primates, certainly many, live currently in altered habitats. So it's not just the Muriqis who we're looking at that are living in different habitats and behaving in different ways. Many of our primates and other animals are in the same boat. They're in the same situation where we can't be sure what it is that they're seeing. So it turned out that Muriqis have a really eclectic diet. About half of their diet is leaves, about a third is fruit, everything else is flowers and bark. But as we would expect on their from their locomotor system, their suspensory locomotion gives them the access, like spider monkeys, to pursue long distance, widely dispersed fruit sources. And in fact, that is what they eat whenever they can. And so there's an interesting sort of scenario where, given the choice, they prefer fruit, which they supplement with leaves. But across the other populations, we now know there's a wide variation where some populations, they're eating 50 or 60 or 70% of their diet in fruit, and others eating 50, 60, 70% of their diet in leaves. So they have the ability to eat lots of different foods. And this is probably one of the reasons why they've been able to survive in so many altered habitats. Their social behavior is what really makes them unusual. They live in multi-male, multi-female groups. They have very distinctive faces, which I think you can see just in a quick look here. If you look at their brow shape, the shape of their nostrils and their muzzles, and they don't always sit in identical postures like these two, but I think it really shows how possible it is to recognize them individually. And so early on, I was able to start detecting studying them as individuals. So what's so interesting about their social behavior is that they are so peaceful, and there's no evidence of agonistic based hierarchical relationships among males or among females or between males and females. So really egalitarian, probably more so than any other primates we know. Males spend a lot of time in close proximity to one another, and they're highly affiliative with a lot of physical contact and hugging and relaxed interactions. Males and females are similar to one another in both their body size and their canine size, so that has consequences, implications for the fact that males don't have any coercive power over females. And they're very tolerant toward one another's mating behavior, sexual activity. This copulation, the females in front, the males behind, is interesting because to the females, to her right, our left on the screen, is another male who's just waiting for his turn to copulate with the same female. And if she wants to do that, she will allow him to. And if she doesn't, she'll just walk away, and he may follow her a little bit, but eventually she'll move off, and that will be it. When we compare, again, thanks to genetic work done with Paulo Chaves and Antonio Di Fiore and collaborators in Brazil, from our first paternity study, Muriqis turn out to, we see the same impact of what we see behaviorally. We see it in their distributions of paternity relative to the highest degree of paternity success in this different species. The species with male phylopatry, where males are closely related to one another, tend to have less reproductive skew than species in which males are not closely related to one another. And the Muriqis have even lower reproductive skew, as you might predict, if not only are males related to one another, but there's no obvious hierarchy among them. So this peaceful, egalitarian, promiscuous lifestyle, females can mate with multiple males, gave the Muriqis a reputation as being the hippie monkeys. And of course, as a young new PhD, I was excited to, find out more about their lifestyles. So in the beginning, there were always two groups. And as I mentioned, and by the way, here you can see from this Google map, you'll see it in later slides too, this is a real forest fragment. Real forest fragment. And there were two groups, and this probably helped a lot in terms of the females early on. In fact, during the first year of my dissertation research, was lucky to crack this code in a way, because I started seeing female migration, females switching between groups. Over the years, this has continued. We now know females disperse from their natal groups around 6 years of age, and we know from non-invasive hormonal work that they do this prior to the onset of puberty. Births are seasonally concentrated, and there's about a 3-year birth interval. So in life history, variables, Muriqi's are very, very slow. One of the ways it's been possible to run this long-term project has been because I have been really fortunate to recruit Brazilian students. And in fact, I've had more than 77. I say more than 77 because I can't remember if that's including the current ones or not. Some of them stay on for a couple of years. And so we have over 107 years of research. You can see up in the upper right-hand corner, this year's team, they're all masked, but they're still going out to the forest. And a lot of these, more than half of them use these data from the project for their graduate dissertations, and 2/3 of them stayed in biology and conservation. So I'm really proud of this success, and it's thanks to them. We go through a long training period so they can learn how to recognize all the individuals, and then we can keep track of them without having to mark them over the course of their individual lives. We've also been able to monitor female reproductive success as a result of this continuous continuity and observation. And so we know that females give birth at a median age of 9 years. We've done hormonal work, so gestation is 7.2 months. The cycle length is about 21 days. And mothers are really attentive. They're really good moms. Babies stay on their mom's ventrum for the first couple of months. They move to their backs and get carried for an extended period of time. Mothers change their social behavior. They socialize with one another more closely when they have kids the same age. And they invest a lot of energy in helping to make sure their kids figure out how to become locomotor, to be able to travel independently. And this is like a second weaning period in a way, the locomotor independence that I think has been underestimated in a lot of primate literature. It's a form of maternal investment that it's hard to measure, but we really see it in these moms because they spend a lot of time going back to fetch their kids and to help their kids cross difficult passages, using their body to make bridges for their kids. Muriqis, compared to other primates, this is from our Primate Life History group, have a high life a very high life expectancy at birth, and they're second only to chimpanzees and tied with gorillas for how long they live, which can be into their 40s. And the fact that females disperse and males stay in their natal groups means that males grow up with all their male kin, and they also grow up, they spend their entire lives with their mothers. And we have great-grandmothers who live into their 40s who have now been in the same group with their sons, their grandsons, and in some cases, their great-grandsons. And so this is, again, something I think we tend not to think about as much as we do about extended matrilines, but the implications not just of male-male relationships, but the role that grandmothers, mothers and grandmothers can play in their sons and their grand offspring lives. And I think that this long, the fact that mothers have lifelong opportunities to invest in their sons might contribute to some of the high tolerance that we see among males, and that these feed back into questions about life history, which again has been looked at in other species for female lineages, but not so much for males. So over time, in the beginning, I was studying a single group that one of the groups, and we would follow females into the other group, but we didn't stay with that group. I say we because I started taking assistance early on. And this group had increased over time. Now, I show this a lot. It was in one of the papers I listed, because I think it's really important when group size is such an important variable that people use to measure in a lot of analyses. And yet in any long-term study, we see changes in group size. And so just randomly partitioning parts of the study into different time periods, you could get, you know, a fourfold difference in what you thought was the median group size, depending on what period of time that was. And I think this is a really important factor to keep in mind. And it's also the case, this isn't just Muriqi's. When Phyllis Lee and Tony Ives and I looked at comparative data, that demographic variation, this is plotting CVs in group size over the number of data points for those groups or populations, it's a very strong positive relationship. And it's not to say that all of these groups, all of these other populations, the groups aren't necessarily increasing. It's that there's a lot of variation. And so the longer you watch groups, the more variation you're likely to see. And it's not surprising either. We've known for a long time, I mean, dating back to one of my favorite examples from the 1980 infanticides controversies and discussions, how different demographic conditions led to or predicted different kinds of different prevalence of infanticide in intraspecific comparisons. So it's not surprising that to see this kind of change, a group that increased from 22 animals to more than 140 in a 14-year period, in a 24-year period, would show behavioral changes. And these, I want to talk about two of these because I think they're really interesting. The first occurred when the population, about 15 years into the study, when this group had increased by more than twice its size, almost 3 times its size. And the home range expanded, but the day range didn't. So the per capita traveling was the same. What they did was they split up their group, split into fission-fusion dynamics, smaller subgroups, which makes perfect sense because there are finite number of feeding sites. And to avoid competition, they split up. So I think that's a really, clear and obvious, predictable response. The second big change occurred again when the population, the group had increased. This study group had now increased even further, and the population had expanded. So by this point, by 2002, we were studying the entire population. The population initially grew from 2 groups with about 40 or 50 animals, increased 5-fold in about a 20-year period. And the population density increased 4-fold. One of the groups had grown so much it split on different occasions. And now the animals stuck in that finite area had to modify their behavior. And so they began spending more time on the ground. And although the amount of time they spend on the ground is still relatively low, it's a high percentage increase. And I got to tell you, it was like surreal watching this happen. I mean, suddenly they weren't just coming down to the ground, they're starting to walk around bipedally. I mean, and just like carrying food with them as they go, moms with their babies hanging on their back in a completely different posture. One of my least cited papers, but I think it's one of the best because it was so exciting, was that we actually caught this process where we could watch individuals that had never been seen on the ground to start coming to the ground, and that they were doing this in the company of their social networks. Males did it first, females did it last. New females that joined the group would wait until they were integrated before they started using the ground. It's just really, really super interesting phenomenon. And it was also really surreal because I could see this. This was from a camera trap in the forest that we set to catch this behavior when there were no people around. So we asked the question, do Muriqis come to the ground when no one is there? Because maybe they were learning this behavior from us or using us as buffers or something. So I have to show you this video. Nobody's anywhere nearby. So here's a Muriqui on the ground. He stands up. there's one in the foreground, but another one comes and hugs him, walks over and hugs another guy. This guy stands up, they're still deciding what to do, and then he kind of goes back into the forest. And, you know, they're looking for food on the ground. He sits down and eventually he climbs up. So, oops, sorry, I'm having a little things. So we also started watching them come down to the ground. And of course, on the ground, they're in a two-dimensional space. So lots of animals can sit together. They can have a lot of contact. These are males. You can see that male, you know, how many primates, males can just yawn like that in a group of other males and no one reacts to their canines. Females were coming to the ground too, but females were mostly eating. And in fact, we think that something about not just having more food on the ground, but also something about the way females could eat without worrying about taking care of their babies so much, worrying about their babies falling or holding their babies might have contributed to the fact that during this period, we also saw an increase in female fertility. So females started, when we modeled the population relative to things like sex ratios and mortality, the population should have been smaller than it was. And we did see this increase in fertility. And the only way we could explain it was that it coincided with this terrestrial behavior. So now I want to switch from, I have been talking mostly about that main group. Here's when they became fission fusion. Here, then the upper line is when they become, when we started the population monitoring and we could extrapolate back to the group when we started seeing ground use. But from here on out, I want to talk about the population, because it's a really unusual phenomenon, because, you know, the bad side is it's a forest fragment with limited number of animals. And the good part is that we can know every single animal. There's no recruitment into the population. So we know basically it's like an agar dish. We know everything that's happening in on this island with these monkeys. And by 2003, there were 4 groups as a result of this fissioning of that green group. And we've been able to monitor the female dispersal between these different groups, and a few of them have moved to the south into some fragments that are outside the reserve, but are accessible through connectivity. Sometimes females just move directly. They just, one day they're with their natal group, and the next day and forever after, they're living in an adjacent group. And sometimes, like this female, they move between different groups. And, you know, we have no idea. This is another female, and she actually spent months in a 3rd group and then disappeared, and we thought she was dead until she was recovered in, you know, found alive in one of these fragments to the south of the forest, So it was, sometimes they take a long time, and sometimes they'll go back to their natal groups. And we have been trying to figure out these patterns, and some are beginning to emerge. So this movement, the population was clearly saturated. You know, they were using right up to the forest edges, but they could also get out of the forest, maybe into some of these surrounding areas. And they had begun, they were beginning to do this in the late, around 2008 or 2009. And you can see how you could sort of get there from some of these connectivity fragments. Well, in 2014, there was a severe drought, and this affected our study site. It was all over Brazil. That dark red in the far corner there, that's where our region is. That's the worst drought in history. It was also some of the worst forest fires. And we had 2 of our 3 forest fires were in these 2 successive years of drought, 2014 and 2015. This is October's the end of the dry season down there. Unfortunately, and in comparison to what we've heard about some of the howler monkeys recently in Argentina, especially, and many of the primates and other animals in places like Pantanal and Australia, it's just devastating to know about animals that are suffering from fire. We didn't lose any primates, but we did see the animals go through severe ecological stress as their water sources started to dry up. And, you know, here you can see the stream bank and where this animal had to climb all the way down to try to get some to try to get some water. And by the end of this period, these animals were, getting water from mud. They were really, really working hard at this. We would have expected this to have a huge impact on female reproduction and infant mortality, but amazingly, it didn't. And I want to just orient you to this sequence of slides because it shows what happened with the population during these periods. So the top graph there is annual rainfall with the mean and standard deviation over a 30-year period, and then and it's cumulative rainfall. So you can see in the beginning, you get the very end of 2013, and then 2014 was lower than the standard deviation below the mean, and then 2015 again. By 2016, the rainfall is normal. 2017, it's normal. 2018 is still low. So the population in the drought, it sort of started to decline, but then it had that nice birth season boost and it recovered. 2015, it declines again, but it had another birth season boost. And 2016, the rains came early. We were really optimistic that things were going to look good, but the population declined and it had a very small birth season boost, but then continued to decline. And the reason for that decline is probably related to the fact that this is exactly when one of the worst outbreaks of yellow fever in decades hit this region of Brazil. And my field site was right in the center of that worst area of the outbreak. So this affected the marmosets, it affected the howler monkeys. And in fact, one of my former postdocs, Carla Passamai, has been monitoring this, and in our forest, we've lost 80 to 90% of the howler monkeys, 90% of the marmosets, about 30 to 50% of the capuchin monkeys. The Muriqis didn't suffer as much. We only lost about 10% of them at that point, about 30 animals. But the fact that we lost that many in a 6-month period was pretty startling. I also put these skeletal materials here because I think it's a good metric. We know exactly how many animals we lost during this period of time, and we only found 4 skeletal remains, which tells you something that when people, come in with dead animals, and they think an animal died, what the magnitude of true loss really is. And this is with, I'm sure we didn't miss any, maybe 1 or 2, but we certainly didn't miss 30 animals. Skeletal remains, and yet we know they died during this period. So here again is this demographic trend. You see the big decline for yellow fever. That bar is the period, the 6 months of yellow fever, and you can see that was quite a decline. Well, 2017 was supposed to be a good year, but actually the population continued to decline, and so this was maybe some accumulated stress from the drought or some persistent yellow fever or social disorder, because when you lose as many animals as we did, suddenly things are different. But in 2018, we saw that again, finally, that birth season boost, and this was encouraging. We thought maybe this was going to come back. And it was nice because we saw parallel trends for both the males and the females during this time. So, the demographics of the population were staying similar, and it was true also across ages. But what we were just seeing, we're losing animals all consistently. And then we get to 2019, and some of you who've seen these slides before might remember this is where I stopped last year, because we got that birth season boost, but then 2019 was a low rainfall year and the population declined again, just a little bit more than it had. So we didn't know what had happened, and now, sorry, I'm having trouble there. And now you can see, I'm moving this up now to show you. So again, there we go, the whole population. And we've got that yellow fever in the later years where the steep decline is. We had another fission, so now we have 5 social groups. And I'm very happy to say that in the last year, the population has stabilized. So does this mean that we are now going to, Are we stable? Is the population going to increase? We haven't yet had the birth season, the end of the birth season boost yet, so I can't tell you whether we're going to see it increasing. But there are lots of possible explanations for what happened during these last 5 years. You know, we know the population has relatively low genetic diversity compared to others. It was a smaller population. It's grown because of, it's grown internally. We know there's ongoing ambient stress from episodic drought periods and changes in ecological system, although the forest is protected and expanding. There might be some undetected demographic constraint, or I'm beginning to think that there's something going on with the forest, and whether we're now basically reverting back to what I would consider carrying capacity, or whether we're looking at, you know, some kind of ecological crash is going to kind of depend on how things look in the future. We know that the habitat is regenerating. We can see this happening before our eyes, and we know that the Muriqis use really early successional regeneration, and this is probably something that's really a key to their persistence despite so many variables. You can see these exact images taken from the exact same spot along a dirt path, how much in just 12 years the habitat has naturally regenerated. Here, the perspective on these Google images is slightly different, but if you just look at the some of the open areas in the southern part in the bottom of the slide in these like lacunae inside the forest, and then you look at this map, find those same areas, which is greener, so it looks better, but it's not just greener, it's also there's more forest today. And that's because some of these lacunae are closing up because people aren't farming them anymore, and because the edges are expanding. If we look at this population and the percent of just the variation, you know, we definitely see these fluctuations, big fluctuations. And of course, there's the big drop from yellow fever, the big fluctuation. What's interesting to me, and the reason why I'm really interested in this idea of carrying capacity, is just because the variation from year to year had begun to slow down before that peak, coincidental with the big transition of the monkey spending a lot of time on the ground. And that now, even though the population is, you know, the variation is below zero, we're starting to see some return to what had been pre-crash levels of population change. And this brings me to the bigger question, which is that I don't think we yet know how to talk about what we would consider this variation or change over time. So we know how to talk about population differences. We even know how to compare within population group differences. But I don't think we're yet very good at, I still don't know, do I have an N of 1 because I'm studying one population? Or do I have an N of 39 because it's been 39 years? How we characterize this period. And I think this is an important issue because a lot of times when we talk about interspecific variation, people make space for time substitution errors. And ecologists know that, you know, these are often used as an alternative to long-term studies. You compare different places and different populations instead of one over time, and make erroneous assumptions that it's the same thing, the same kind of variation. But that you really need the long-term studies to understand the temporal change, to understand the mechanisms of any kind of behavioral change. So if we came in and just looked at this population change without, at any point in time, without knowing its history, we would have no idea of all the things that I've just spent the last 30 minutes talking about. So what does all this mean? Well, I think it's really interesting. And for me, this is, you know, just super exciting because we now, I think, have enough perspective and comparative studies and transitional behavior over time to identify behavioral traits that are flexible, that are highly plastic in response to changes that might be variable across time. And I think the fission-fusion, the shift between fission-fusion and cohesive groups is a good example of that. I'm less certain about this shift to the terrestrial niche because I think it was originally driven by ecological necessity, overcrowding, food need for food, additional food resources. But now that the population is reduced in size and some of the interspecific competitors, like the howler population has been so severely reduced from yellow fever, I don't know why they're still using the ground. My students just saw an ocelot kill an adult female like the last week or 2 weeks ago. So we know that it's dangerous for these, and we have other evidence of predation as well. We know it's dangerous for them on the ground, and they shouldn't need to be there unless it's become part of their cultural or social tradition, behavioral tradition. I think that's a whole area of primate social evolution we need to explore because it's so hard to separate out what's going on. Equally interesting to me are these two features, the fact that despite even when the population had grown, and even now when you might say it's in somewhat disarray, the population has stayed very peaceful. The relationships are still egalitarian within groups, and female dispersal has been very consistent. So let me spend some time just talking briefly about each one of these. Again, in a follow-up study with Tony Di Fiore and Paulo Chaves to look at another cohort of infants to see whether that low reproductive skew that we had found originally was that an odd year, or was that persistent? And so these are data that from Paulo's dissertation that we're currently in the process of writing up. But when I look at this, I see some variation, but an overall consistent pattern. The most successful male in the second cohort is a little bit more successful, but not that much. Slightly lower percentage of possible males have sired at least one kid. The youngest age of the youngest sire in this second cohort is a little bit younger, and we consistently, both behaviorally and genetically, see no evidence of mothers and sons having kids together. The dispersal pattern thing, I guess, makes a lot of sense that it would be consistent and persistent because we know that dispersal patterns have a really strong phylogenetic signal. And we know that dispersal patterns are important. They're fundamental to every single thing you can think about in terms of life histories, opportunities to socialize with your extended kin, who you need to avoid for reproduction, and any kind of nepotism or kin-based sociality. But dispersal patterns are also really important for anything you want to do with managing endangered species, translocations, reintroductions, or captive breeding. And this is color-coded very deliberately because I'm going to be talking about the Muriqis and some of these, the implications of dispersal patterns for management. But also want to call your attention to the fact that across the primate order, the concentration of male bias dispersal with extended female kinship is very restricted into the old world monkeys, and that in the apes and new world primates, we don't see it very often. So with apes, you never see it. These data, all of these data, parameters, reproductive parameters, social behavior, have been used, incorporated directly into the Brazilian National Action Plan for the Conservation of Muriqis. I think this is one of the things that makes a long-term study make sense, is when you can actually see your data not just advancing science, but actually helping to save the species you love. And we've used this information to develop our protocol for how you manage emergency situations for the Muriqis. And I don't expect, you can't read this and it takes a long time, but I call your attention to that everything leads to the fact that once you make a decision, you have to decide to manage, and how you manage the populations or the animals, again, making a first decision about whether you're going to do it in situ or ex situ. All of this requires that you have a lot of knowledge about the animals. So like I said earlier, I was really lucky during my dissertation research to see dispersal early on. This has persisted over time. We know sometimes females disperse by themselves. Sometimes females disperse with their cohorts. We know that sometimes females disperse selectively into groups where they have either an older sister or into a group where they have a familiar female who had dispersed earlier from their natal group, and that they socialize preferentially with those individuals when they get into these groups. One of the things that has totally amazed me, and I'm just looked at these data, so it's really exciting. If we sum up the 119 dispersal events, these are all cases in which females were successfully seen in a new non-natal group. It's not measuring how long they lived there or whether they move to a second group. It's just the first time they leave their natal group to the first time they get into a new group. So in the beginning, there was just the single study group, but then from 2002 forward, 4 groups. And the age of dispersal has stayed amazingly constant. And it's really stunning to me that it has persisted to be really constant despite the last 5 years of demographic changes, the sudden demographic changes. And this says to me something about how hard, how solid this might be, and how important it is from dispersal. The other thing that we've seen is really strong seasonality in when females disperse. And again, 119 cases, very seasonal. We don't see very rare dispersal occurring during the peak dry season months when the days are shorter but colder and there's less abundant food. Fortunately, my colleagues who have been involved in active translocations with female Muriqis and other populations have adhered to this, have used this as a guideline in terms of when they've captured females and moved them to other groups. And in all cases, these these translocations have been successful. So in that regard, it's hard to say, in situ and ex situ conservation and management, but I think both of these have real relevance. And I want to very quickly talk about 3 other forests where colleagues of mine are working, because I think what they're doing is really important. And I think it shows some of the examples of how these long-term processual data become really useful. The first place I want to talk about is a place called Fazenda Esmeralda in Rio Casca. And this is a place that is about a 40-hectare forest. It's privately owned. And it had one group of Muriqis that we've known about for a long time. It's been studied by various people in the late 80s and early 90s. So at its peak, the population had about 22 animals, and then it continued to decline. And by 2003, there was only 1 female and 2 males left in this population. And so clearly, this population was going to go extinct. And my colleague, Fabiano Gemello, deserves a lot of credit for being the person who, at a time when many of us were just saying, oh, we should protect the big populations, focus on those, he was arguing we need to save all of the Muriqis. And so he led the campaign to bring the last surviving male from that population to the Belo Horizonte Zoo, where, because the others, by the time all the permits had been approved, there was only 1 male left. And the plan was always to bring this male a female from another population so that they could preserve these genes. And unfortunately, he lived 8 or 9 years in captivity and died right before a transfer was supposed to happen. This was really stunning because not only were there no longer any Muriqis from this population left in the wild, but the population, the genes from these Muriqis were gone. Extinction. And, most of us don't have the experience, I'm glad, to live through what my colleagues and I lived through, which was the sense of tremendous responsibility that we watched this population go extinct and we acted too late. So when the opportunity came along to save another population, this is another forest, Ibichipaca, about 400 kilometers away, we took more action. There was a lot more enthusiasm. This is also about a 40-hectare forest that was known to have a population of Muriqis that was declining over time. So by 2014, in June, there were 4 males left, so clearly they had no future. And by August of that year, 2 of the males had disappeared, so the situation was really dire. And the decision here was made to bring these males into captivity. The owner of this particular forest was willing to invest in all the resources necessary to create a captive breeding facility, and they were able to get permissions from Brazil. And so there again is Fabiano and Fernanda Tabacao, who's someone who's worked with me for many years and got her training in Caratinga. And they brought these 2 males into, they basically, let's save these males and let's start a captive breeding program to keep this population's genetic representation alive. And to get the females, we knew of another population, Sosego, and this is a project that Fernanda, who I just showed you, had been studying. It was a place that had been the recipient of a translocated female back in 2006. And this female successfully reproduced in this forest. And it was a good thing too, because during the yellow fever outbreak, it was this female and her offspring who ended up surviving, and ultimately after the yellow fever outbreak in this population, representing 20% of the population remaining here. But this population has a problem because it only has 1 group. So the forest is about the same size as Caratinga, but there's not a second group. There are so few animals. So when females disappear, they're probably trying to disperse. And in this particular case, because people in the region they'd been doing a lot of conservation outreach, the local farmers contacted the researcher when a Muriqui appeared in their forest, in their backyard, basically 11.5 kilometers away from the reserve, which was the daughter of the female who had been translated when she was 7 years old. So this female was one of the females that was brought into the captive breeding program. And I just want to show you here what would have happened to this population with and without that translocated female and all her kids. And the black line on top shows you that female with her kids. She started with 2 kids when they started monitoring the population. She had 3 subsequent kids. Both she and at that time she had 4 offspring survived. But the bottom line shows you what the population would have looked like without her. And the problem is it's not having as much of an impact as everyone thought because her daughters dispersed. So we've lost 2 of her daughters. One of them was rescued, brought into Ibitipaca, where she's now, we think she's pregnant and expecting any day. And a second female from that same population was also bred in. This is an amazing outdoor enclosure. It was the 2 local males, so they knew each other, philopatric males, together, don't fight. And these 2 females who are used to dispersing, they got along great. And after they had had time to interact, they were then released into this protected forest outside the enclosure. And ultimately, when the breeding group is established, they'll be able to be moved back into the forest. And so, it's a pretty amazing opportunity. We're really optimistic about it. And it's all the work done by Fabiano de Mello and Fernanda Tabacao. But one of the things that I think is really important, and to get to the end of my talk, is that when we used to talk about translocation, we were all worried about weighing things like disease against the benefits of the genetic contribution that new animals would bring into populations. But I don't think that people have given as much attention to see the real life phenomenon as well, of the ways in which dispersal and mating patterns can affect these genetic and demographic contributions. Because if you move females and females end up in a small population and they're going to leave, you've just basically created a source and sink phenomenon where your females and your translocated animals are maybe not having the level of impact that they were intended to have. And for slow reproducing animals like Muriquis, where it takes 6 or 7 years to see these impacts, it becomes really important to know and think about these things in advance. And so I feel like disease is something we know, we're all living it, protect yourselves and others from, but that these behavioral traits may be more difficult. So in going back to my original question of how do we reconcile these adaptations over evolutionary time with high levels of flexibility, I hope you can help me answer that question, because I don't really know after all this time. All I can say is that I think we really do need not just long-term data, but we need long-term comparative data. So we need to basically be able to move the kinds of comparisons, phylogenetic control comparisons that we've been doing for a long time, interspecifically and intraspecifically with different populations. We need to find ways to do this comparatively with long-term data, behavioral controlling for behavioral as well as demographic change. And statistically, it's complex, and I think we need to find ways to do that. But I can say very compellingly and definitively that from what we've seen, that recognizing which of these behavioral traits are flexible versus the conservative traits, the ones that seem to be stable, that persist despite all kinds of changes, that I think that understanding these things is really important for making informed conservation and management decisions, and that applying these not just to in situ conditions, but also, but as well as ex situ conditions. So I am more optimistic today than I was 5 years ago when we had drought and fires and yellow fever. And part of the reason is because I'm seeing that these management efforts can really make a difference. And I feel like that is going to be increasingly an important component of a lot of our ability to save or to revitalize some of these critically endangered populations, that we're getting the know-how, and we've got new generations of people involved. And all the students who are listening to this talk, I hope that this inspires some of you to try to find ways in which to turn your scientific interest into ways that you can actually put those theories to application. There are lots of people to thank, all those 77 students who have contributed to the project, as well as various funding agencies and Brazilian collaborators. And I want to thank all of you for your attention and for patience with my talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thanks to all for joining us. For those, just a quick reminder so we can go straight to the session of questions and answers. I have muted you all. I imagine that you can probably unmute yourself, I hope. If not, I'll unmute you when you ask a question. As we've always done, what I ask that is that you please type in the chatting window, just a question mark to indicate that you have a question. You can either do that to everyone, so that actually that's better than just sending it to me. That way people know where they are in line. And then I'll be inviting you to ask the question. So thank you very much, Karen. Fascinating talk. I'm sure that we're going to have lots of questions and opportunities for follow-up on some of your data and interesting questions and findings. So the first questions that I see is from Karsten. Karsten, like we've done, if you very briefly just state where you are and your affiliation and take it from there. Can you tell me if you can unmute yourself or if I need to go and unmute everyone? If you cannot, let me, what I'm going to do is then modify. Hold on, give me a second. So I modify for everyone. Okay, there we go. I have just allowed everyone. You've been good kids. So I've been giving you permission to unmute yourself as you please. Karsten.
So I'm Carsten Schradin from the CNRS in Strier, studying striped mice in South Africa. Thanks, Karen, for a fascinating talk. It's great to see all these changes you observed over so many decades and that you could do this. I have a very basic question to understand all these changes you observed, and I apologize, probably you said at the beginning the answer to my question, at least you implied it. What is the reason that your study population started so small with only 20 monkeys in one group? Is it because there was previously hunting and they were reduced to this small size, or why was this starting point so small compared to where you are now?
So that's a great question, and you didn't miss anything at all, because I always start, the world started when I got there, right? In my understanding of the situation. But actually, we have been able to trace back some of the original correspondence of the owner of the forest. So we know that in 1979, he was writing correspondence to the head of the Rio de Janeiro Primate Center to tell him he had a group of Muriqis in his forest with, I think he said 9 animals. So that takes it back even further in time. So what happened in this region, which is what happened in most of southeastern Brazil, was that the Portuguese got there, and first of all, they used the Atlantic forest in the 1800s to basically build their navy. And then subsequently, those were the coastal cities where pretty much Brazil, all the mining explorations, all the European explorers went through Rio de Janeiro, Vitória, further in the south. And so that basically resulted in severe deforestation. And that's why so much of this region was clear cut for farms and pasture in this area. Probably what happened was that there was a lot of hunting in that region as well. And there was certainly a demographic, something was going on demographically in this population, because when the owner of this forest purchased the land in 1945, he promised the person he brought it from, the only reason there was forest left there was because the person he had purchased it from told him to save, he would only sell it if he agreed to save the forest. So he then prohibited hunting. And so it was the combination of deforestation in the surrounding region, a relic population surviving, that was probably a founding population that was then protected through passive means by the owner. And that what we're seeing is the population growth and recovery from that, and an expanded habitat.
So sorry, one question to this. In this area, you never have or had problems of poaching, even if the forest is kind of protected, that people from neighboring village go in to get some meat like we would see in Africa. This is not a problem.
No, it's really different in this part of Brazil. It's really different. I've been in East Africa, and so I know a little bit of what your frame of reference is. But it's very different too from places up in the Amazon, in the following sense, that this is mostly that it's this. Well, I remember driving out to this field site actually at the same meeting that Zulema was and I were at, where I met Zulema with Alison Jolly and her, who worked in Madagascar, and she was saying, oh, everybody here has, even the poor, small little houses in the countryside, people had television antenna. That is, the idea was that it wasn't people, this isn't a region where people needed to go and hunt meat for survival. The owner had, these were in the days where he would shoot anyone who entered his forest. So there was a lot of self-protection. The reason I believe this to be true was because when I did go there in 1982, while the Muriqis weren't habituated to being followed, they didn't run away. They didn't see people as threats. They were wary, but they weren't animals that had been hunted and were being pursued. So I think they were used to seeing people who would come in and cut trees down, but not to hunt them. And that was really strongly prohibited. And that's one of the reasons too, why I think with increased conservation effort, the population could recover as well as it did. So I don't think that this would necessarily happen everywhere.
Okay, thank you.
The next question is from Zulema.
Yeah, fascinating talk, Karen. I have a couple of questions. I was really struck by how peaceful they are within groups, and I was wondering if that carries over to encounters between groups, and specifically if there's any sign of aggression or rejection when females are dispersing into new groups, if you've had a chance to actually see that. And then a related question, you mentioned that the groups are very highly inbred. And I was wondering if there's genetic differentiation between groups. So with the dispersal going on from the females, I'm wondering if that sort of damps out any between group genetic variation, or whether you still get lots of genetic variation between groups. I forgot to say, this is Suleima Tang Martinez, University of Missouri, St. Louis in the US. Thanks.
Thanks, Zulema. Those are great questions. So the first one was about intergroup aggression. And what we see is that sometimes groups feed peacefully side by side, and sometimes groups have a lot of vocalization and sometimes aggression. So we see it intergroup. Female dispersal, again, we see a lot of variations. Sometimes there'll be an intergroup encounter, which will mostly be vocalization between groups. And then that'll be when a female will make her move. And so, you know, if we have captured this with simultaneous observers, one, you know, student's there with the group and then she doesn't see the animals again. And then another student said, oh, a new female came in right after that encounter, and they figure out who it was. Sometimes though, the females are marginalized. Like what happens is a female will come into the group and she'll stay peripheral. She'll be trying to follow the group, and then she'll lose them, and she'll vocalize to try to find them, and no one answers her. So they get kind of marginalized in that way. But sometimes, and especially if they have familiar animals from their natal groups that they recognize, they interact much quickly, and they integrate right away. But I can't tell you, I still can't tell you, even with all of these pretty close observations on migration. So I would say that the best ways that females integrate, if they don't already know someone, is by playing with the young, and then their mothers of the young start tolerating them, and then they end up usually start being just allowed to stay with them. But they maintain some peripheral behavior. They're not expelled, and nor are they ever. We've never seen a female expelled from her natal group the way that you sometimes see in other species. So we don't see that level of aggression. But there is some intergroup aggression. I would say when the population was at its peak, the largest in 2015 with 356 animals, which is 7 times larger than it was when I started, just to keep those numbers in mind. We would see there was a new faction, the 5th group, that was trying to establish themselves, and we see that in network analysis, it's separate. But that group didn't have any place to go. They kept bumping into the other groups, and there'd be vocalizations all over the place. I mean, there's some of the noisiest times in the forest where basically we felt sorry for this group because they couldn't find a place to be. But there's a lot of overlap between the groups. So I think that some of that crowding that we're picking up is because the density is so high. But I should also add that even in the beginning, when the density was low and you saw those 2 groups far apart from one another, there's 40% overlap in their home ranges. So the animals were moving back and forth. They were definitely checking out. We don't have very good data on we haven't done it yet, the intra-group versus intergroup genetic variation. We haven't made that comparison. What we did see looking at genetic diversity, again, this is from Paulo Chaves' research in Tony DeFiore's lab. So it's his dissertation research. Surprisingly, that we would have expected, because of female dispersal, that there was more genetic diversity among females than there was among males. The males philopetric and females dispersing, that at least in the beginning, they were exchanging groups, even if that's all they were doing. But, and we didn't see as big of a difference as we would have expected from that. And that may have been because the founding population was very genetically, what was left when this population had been reduced, getting back to Karsten's question, and then began to grow again, that we're still coming out of that. But compared to other populations of Muriqis, this population is not as genetically diverse as some of them, and it's not as genetically homogeneous as others. So I think the fact that it's not as homogeneous as others is because it has multiple groups. The reason that it's not as heterogeneous as some of the other populations that are even smaller in size probably is a result of the fact that this one was from a small founding population, whereas the others are in more meta-population landscapes.
Let me follow up with a very quick comment from what you just said in your answer that I find really interesting. Many, many years ago, back in the 70s, at the beginning of my career, I was doing field work on black-tailed prairie dogs, and one of my interests was dispersal. And one of the things that I found fascinating is that just like you discussed for the females, if you had a group of prairie dogs, a coterie, a family group, and the male died, you would have males dispersed in, but the way that they became integrated into the group appeared to be precisely like you mentioned for females. They would start out on the periphery of the territory playing with the young in the group. And over time, females seemed, at the beginning, they would sort of try to chase them off, but as they kept coming back and playing with the juveniles and in some cases babies, the females slowly seemed to develop this, toleration. And by the end, the males then, the male, because it was usually one male, would become integrated in the group. But it all started with their interacting and
with
playing
babies.
with babies.
Yeah. And of course, for you in that system, you've got the risk of, I guess, males could be infanticidal, whereas, we wouldn't expect to see that with the females, although, and we certainly have never seen that.
Yeah, and I never saw infanticide in the prairie dogs either. So yeah, thanks.
Next question is from Ute.
Hi, Karen. Here's Ute
Hi.
Arnspiel from Institute of Zoology from Germany. And great talk. Thanks for
Thank
that.
you.
And I was very fascinated by your story of the terrestriality and the increase in that behavior over time when population became larger and population density became higher. You seem to imply this was kind of driven by the need to explore additional food resources. But if there's such a plasticity in this trait, I was wondering whether the Muriqis can use that flexibility or plasticity also to install or to restore connectivity in a fragmented landscape and go out of the forest, not only to go down to the floor to feed, but maybe also bridge open spaces and connect to other fragments that are maybe not directly in reach, but if you go over open spaces, you may still connect. So whether this is even giving hope for future conservation avenues for this species. I mean, we know the same phenomenon, for example, from sea facas, from lemurs from Madagascar, where they also go out into the open. They can connect in a very highly fragmented landscape, and you don't find so much genetic depletion in these little isolates that you still find compared to those these species that are strictly arboreal and they wouldn't go over these open spaces. So what is your opinion about that?
Well, our first paper on terrestriality was actually in 1996 when we saw females crossing gaps in the forest that had been cleared from tree clearing, and that basically we were speculating that they could go outside the forest. But actually, I did show very quickly the slide of the females dispersing outside the forest into those fragments to the south, and that they were definitely using those connectivity. And then the female that was that I talked about that had been translocated from the other population for the rescue, that was 11.5 kilometers away from her natal forest, she would have had to get there by going through an agricultural forest landscape matrix. So she was definitely on the ground for parts of the time. We know these animals can come to the ground and they can we know at my field site, they're moving to the south. In fact, our corridor project, which we have to connect it to the other forest, is we're basically following the Muriqis, the ones that the forest that these fragments that they're moving into is exactly where we're trying to make the connectivity more efficient, because it's really dangerous for them on the ground. They get attacked by dogs as well as terrestrial predators, and we worry about pathogens. And there aren't any big roads here yet, but there could be in the future. So we worry about all those things, but we definitely think that that's a potential for them to come to the ground. I mean, that the fact that they come to the ground is potential for them to disperse further. And we know that they're doing this because all those translocated females that have been selected, I showed 3, and then there have been 2 additional ones. They all came from females that were found in isolated fragments away from the forest where their groups were. And so to get to these fragments, they would have to have crossed the ground. So they could definitely be doing that. I guess one of the things we'd like to do is make a corridor that's so enticing to them that even if they're not feeding in these connective areas, that they're defecating along the ways, and then they're dispersing seeds, and so they can help, planting along the way, which is, also really nice things to imagine. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think I'm coming next. I have a very applied related question. Have you, working with such an endangered species, large animal, if these were not primates, if these were mice, we'll probably not even be thinking twice about just harvesting some of those individuals from what looks like an overcrowded population and translocating left and right and try to have as many experiments as possible. So the exercise here is really to put aside for a little bit ethical reasons and really think about the science of population biology, etc. Now, but these are not mice. These are, so are you guys entertaining at all the possibility of using the Caratinga population as a source population for really saving the species? I mean, the ethical issues are around the well-being. I was thinking about those 1 or 2 Muriqis brought into captivity. I'm thinking the California condor. I'm thinking all these examples where we sacrificed the well-being of certain animals, certain individuals for the species or the population. So we go into the applied daily discussions that I'm sure you must be having. Where are you guys with the possibility of relying on the population for contributing to saving the species?
So that is a really good question. And it's also one that we have talked a lot about, and very openly, I mean, very seriously. So I would say 3 things, trying to think about the sequence in to talk about it. First of all, my personal views, how much or little I would advocate for hands-on management. I started out more as a purist and say, let's just save the forest, save the habitat, and of course I was encouraged by this because my city population was growing. We were saving the forest and protecting them, and the population was growing. But we also realized that demographic study that we did in, that Tony Ives and I did in 2000 and was data through 2010, when the population was about 250, so where it is now, showed this fragility in a way, this instability, because we were seeing this wobbly fertility, and the sex ratio had switched by then to be more male bias of infants. So if they all grow up at this, if they all grow up, it was going to be an adult male bias population, which hasn't happened yet. But the idea was that all the favorable demographics that led to the population growth could very easily reverse. So in trying to identify whether or not this was really was a good source population. But something very important, and I know not all countries have these kinds of settings, but for me personally, and I think for the Muriqis at large, no doubt, was the creation of the Brazilian government, the Institute Chico Mendes for Biodiversity, has, they established this working group on Muriqui conservation, and we developed the National Action Plan. And for me, that group was really important because what it did is, I mean, I still have nightmares about, in a way, the responsibility I have for this population for exactly the reasons you're talking about. Not just you faced your question in terms of using these animals to save the species. I think about it in how do we make sure these animals of this population are protected, and keeping them all in one place may not be the best thing for them either in the long term. If there's a fire, if there's an epidemic, wouldn't it be safer for these animals to be in other places? So this is something that we talked about, annually, at least annually, and of a lot of emails with other experts. And the conclusion so far was that the value of the research, the information we've gained, because none of the other Muriqui populations have the level of monitoring over the long time period that we have. So what we're learning about Muriquis from this population was worth keeping intact to sustaining it, and that for some of these more experimental, important management efforts, the fact that there were populations, individuals, there are always these reports of isolated females that could be recruited into the captive breeding programs. The bigger challenge is where to get males, because we can't just put two males that don't know each other together. That is completely against their social organization. So we can't make new groups with lots of different males. And keeping a male by himself or with one female is a complete different social organization. So a lot of what we've been trying to do, and I say that we because it's very much a group thing, and as a principal investigator and coordinator of this long-term project, I love the fact that we talk about these things and we make these decisions, collaboratively, and thinking about how to achieve the conservation aims while still protecting the value of the research and the information we're accruing. But I would also say the Caratinga population is not the only one. It's the only one we have the whole history of, or at least the last almost 40-year history. But there are some other populations, 2 or 3 populations that have at least 100 animals, some of them in more precarious situations than this one. And so for trying to think about a broader management plan, those might be ones that we would decide would be more opportune to target, because the animals in those places are at greater risk than here. The fact that the Caratinga population has been declining in the last 5 years, I think, surprised my colleagues a lot. And so when this question came up about were we worried about overcrowding, what we started doing is re-emphasizing the importance of expanding the habitat, connecting this forest to another habitat that did have Muriquis, creating the connectivity between it, providing dispersal opportunities for those animals. But I think that we're still probably not, the next priority is not going to be to take these animals, especially right now, because we're still not sure what's happening to this population. I think about the fact that the predictions for climate change in this region, if the models that Fabiano has done, we haven't published these yet, but if they turn out, if they're accurate, then Caratinga would be at one of the extreme, in terms of anticipating what the climate's going to look like in the future, it's going to be at one of the extreme habitable areas for the species. So I'm thinking about trying to find ways to get these Muriquis so that they could all move somewhere else to protect them, and at the same time do conservation. But working with the group in Brazil, with the Brazilian government and Brazilian scientists and conservationists, to making these choices so it's not up to me, is really, really valuable. And what I bring to that is my long history with the animals, my scientific insight and perspective. But when we sit around the table talking about these things, I think my colleagues' views on these ideas are just as important, if not more so, than mine. I think that's a really important component.
Thank you. The next question is from David.
Hi, I'm David. I'm a second-year graduate student of Eduardo's at Yale, and I will actually be asking a question from the YouTube live stream. This is from Susan Alberts. She says, fantastic talk, Karen. How much does terrestriality affect their diet? Do they eat different things or more of the same thing, e.g. the same fruit but fallen? And also, do you know whether Muriqis in other populations ever come to the ground from like camera traps or something?
So the first question, they eat fallen fruits and foods, and they also look for other foods. Like we see them turning over, they'll turn over rocks to get seedlings. We've still never seen them eat anything that's not plant material of some sort. So definitely they've expanded their ecological niche or their diet, range of diet by coming to the ground. But I would say probably 80 or 90% of what they're eating when they're on the ground is foods from the same species they ate when they're feeding from tree substrates. And in fact, one of the, again, if you separate out the ecological from the other side, eating fallen fruit is, of course, is one side of it, but I think they're gaining access to foods that are like growing in really low growing vegetation that they can access more easily, maybe more securely from the ground than if they were suspended or balanced over really small branches, trying to balance their weight while they're feeding on other foods. The second question about Muriqis using the ground from other populations, again, goes back to an earlier question. We know that they're going on the ground because they're leaving these other forests to go looking for dispersal opportunities. So we know that animals every time we find a female in the middle of nowhere in a little tiny forest fragment in someone's backyard, she had to have come from another forest nearby, and how she got there would have been on the ground. It's not like there aren't connectivity ways for them to stay in the trees to make these passages to go 11.5 kilometers to these other places. So we know that other Muriqis are using the ground. But that is a really great segue to let me clarify one thing about the ground use, is that we knew that these Muriqis, even before we started actually explicitly studying it, would come down to the ground to drink water, or sometimes the kids would come down and roll around a little bit. I mean, we saw them on the ground for very short periods, but they were always very short periods and very directed. There was a qualitative and a quantitative transition as this sort of thing that happened every now and then. Oh, you know, the animal was on the ground, or I heard it rustle in the branch and there's an animal on the ground and it ran up into the tree. Transition to being this very common behavior where they spend a lot of time, where they're actually on the ground, not necessarily to come down to eat because they're under a tree with fruit, and not to leave the forest to go to look for another forest. They actually, we've got pictures and camera traps of them sitting underneath a tree with other animals in the tree, and some animals just decide to come down to the ground and they're like laying in the sun or something. So I think there's a fundamental transition in the way the behavior has evolved or has transitioned that we didn't see in the beginning, that we know wasn't happening. And the reason we put the camera traps in was to try to understand whether they were starting to do this because they learned from our observational presence that the ground was a safe place, because they never saw predators when we were there. So we wanted to see if they would come down to the ground when we weren't there, and we discovered that they do. And in other places that have camera traps on the ground, they don't pick the animals up on the ground the way we've seen them. So we know they can use the ground, but they're not using the ground to the same extent that ours are. And that's where I think we captured the introduction or the spread of a new behavioral tradition that may have been driven initially by food and has become something that's just part of their daily life.
Next question is from Susan Perry.
Hi, thanks, Karen. I'm really interested in this topic of social traditions, as well as you know, and I've been trying to collaborate with as many modelers and empiricists as possible to try to think of better ways to empirically to document behavioral variation and where it comes from, how it arises and spreads, and and behaviors are maintained in populations. So I'm really interested in hearing more about the structure of this particular data set you're talking about. I mean, it seems like a beautiful design if you have within the same forest patch, which I assume is probably ecologically pretty similar. If you have that camera trap data, or better yet, focal observations from both of your main groups or multiple groups in the same time period, where one is starting to do this a lot and the other is maintaining its old habits, because that would be a more convincing demonstration that there's really social influence causing this and maintaining that. But I wasn't clear from your talk whether that was the case or whether this was just coming from one group and the camera traps were also just from the same group.
So yeah, so I did, that's a whole separate talk, and but we did, so we had casual opportunistic observations of ground use in the groups that were being followed. And there, you have to understand the history of these groups to understand why some of the groups use the ground more often than others. And some of that has to do with just that where the animals themselves came from. So groups that fission from a ground using group use the ground more. But it's very hard. So let me answer and then go back. We have observations of ground use in 4 of the 5 groups in the forest. We have camera traps that have captured this for this in, we have 5, all the groups in the forest use the ground sometimes, but I would say the behavior on the ground that is more than just coming down to drink or coming down to pick up a fallen fruit is something that we see more regularly in 3 groups, including we were trying to capture whether females that disperse from the group that use the ground the most were importing the behavior into their new groups. And
that's what I was wondering too.
We have anecdotal data for that, but such small sample sizes and not continuous enough observations on the groups that I would say it looks like it probably happened, but I wouldn't try to defend that the basis of those data. So that's the answer. It's widespread in the population. Some individuals do it more. I can't separate out very well the one group that because our observation has always focused on the original group that I started, and that was largely to make sure that we didn't lose the individual life history data with the needing the continuous monitoring of those animals, the really intensive monitoring. Whereas in the other groups, it was more at a demographic level and less at a life history level to keep track of animals, but with limited personnel, not being able to stay with them as continuously, and also a conscious decision on my part not to over habituate the other groups, wanting to keep some of them more wary of people. Again, getting back to Eduardo's, some of the many facets of Eduardo's question, thinking about hedging our bets in terms of what we're doing, because my long-term main study group is really habituated, and I mean, almost scarily so. So I think that to answer your question, maybe explicitly, in that group, when we started seeing the animals coming down to the ground more frequently, we designated, we did an intensive study to see who was coming down, what was the sequence. So that's a group that we have the real detailed dynamics on. Then we have been monitoring in the other groups. Do we see the females that emigrated from that group using the ground more? One thing we saw in my original study group was it was initially male biased, and it seemed like the tradition spread mostly among males and then to females. And in the other groups, it seems to have included females in the start, some of whom were from our natal group. Mm-hmm. Who brought the tradition with them. But I would say it's not, it's really suggestive. It could be anecdotal, but maybe not quantitative.
Yeah, it's really hard to get well, I struggle with that at my site too.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
how much sampling density in one group opposed to getting a broader
Yeah.
coverage of multiple groups is really hard. And you know, these network-based diffusion models are so appealing, but you really have to have a really high density of observations to use them effectively too. So it's frustrating.
So within our main study group during that 2-year period when we published that American Anthropology paper, that one was I'm really confident of what we saw. I mean, that was it was just like amazing to see, like, oh, you know, this female's never done it and now she's doing it. Oh, and she's friends with these males, and you know, sort of watching that whole thing, you know, flow through. But I really think that I can't say, I don't know if we would have the level of data, and like I said, the other groups to put that level of personnel on. I would just think that we probably, because they're already habituated, I'd be worried about those consequences. So probably not going to happen in the near future.
Thanks.
But we do catch them on camera traps.
Very cool.
The next question is from Baptiste Sadoui. Baptiste, we cannot hear you.
Oh.
Now we can.
Okay, sorry.
A bit louder.
Oh. Should be.
You're coming through in very low volume. If you can speak a little bit louder.
Yeah, okay, no problem.
That's better.
Okay, perfect. I will do it like this then. Sorry. So I'm Baptiste Sadoui. I'm PhD student in Julia Osner's lab at the University of Göttingen. Thank you very much for your talk. And I was especially interested in the egalitarian structure of the Muriqis. And I was wondering, have you observed any sign of maybe indirect competition, especially among females, that may translate into differential reproductive success despite the absence of conflicts? Does it imply that you observe or don't observe any preferential bonds among individuals? How do they kind of share their social relationship? And maybe a broader question, but linked to this is my second question. I was wondering if you have guesses on the ecological drivers that might have allowed the evolution of this egalitarian structure, and whether, as you mentioned in the beginning, those population in disturbed and fragmented forest are still allowing us to explore this kind of question, or are they beyond our reach because we don't have natural setting? So yes, this is a package on egalitarian. Thank you.
So if I could start with that last question first, because I think it's really important, and you asked it in a very tactful way, because you get back to the original thing of whether we can believe these results. And I think what we now know, because there have been other studies of northern Muriqis in other populations, including some more continuous forests where and at lower density, and maybe the populations where the population density is low because the animals had been hunted, but the forest is still intact. So, you know, basically every possible variation, the peaceful nature of their societies seems to be really consistent, as does the female dispersal. So I mean, that's a really good point. I should remember this if I use that slide again, to say it's not just from this population, because the two things I put in the category of being sort of persistent, stable characteristics are ones that they're not just persistent and stable in this population, despite all the demographic change. They're also things that we've seen in other populations that are both more disturbed and much less disturbed. So I think that's a hard bottom line. Could you push them into a system where you would see them getting irritable or fight more? I'm sure you could. I think if you didn't give them a way, because the mechanism that they use in nature to avoid that is spatially, physically increased distance. And so in a captive situation, if they were too crowded, if even related males were too crowded together, I don't think they would get along. I think they would get in each other's way. the spatial separation, and it's also come up with some of these captive breeding projects where the females were interfering with each other. Just, they weren't fighting, but they were just getting in each other's way. The females were cycling too close in time, and as soon as they separated the animals, the cycling returned to more natural conditions. So we know that they're affecting each other. So I'm really confident both of what we've seen so far, and I would be happy to allow for the possibility that could all change, but I would certainly believe in captivity. If they were in a place where they were too crowded, they couldn't avoid each other, you might see more antagonism, because when they're at like limited resources, you can tell, I mean, I don't know how to quantify this, but you can tell when they're getting irritated, they move apart. And in fact, one of the key vocalizations that the males use is to, actually the males use calls to bring them closer. One of my former graduate students, Luisa Arneda, did a study on their vocalization, and she found that the calls that the females give most frequently was one that actually pushes them apart. And the females give these calls mostly when they're feeding, and after a call is given, inter-individual spacing increases a little, so that they're, you know, hey, I'm going there, watch out, that's mine. They're saying things to each other in that way. I'm sure that there is indirect competition. You know, we see examples of, you know, animals waiting their turn. When they come, we see animals pushing each other out of the way, and we see these what you'd call minor or non-aggressive displacements. You know, in animals, I mean, how do you know, is this a displacement or is it coincidence? One animal is sitting at a feeding site, another animal comes up and that one leaves. What we don't see is any consistent pattern. We don't see these things escalating, and we don't see a pattern of direct sort of who does. I mean, I looked at these a long time ago. I haven't looked at these data in a long time, but in the past, when I did look at the data, you know, were the females that were doing more of this, were they more likely or less likely to have kids? I mean, there weren't any patterns, but some of it is because the rates are so low that we just don't have sample sizes for it. That's the biggest barrier to a lot of the social behavior analyses. When you see these big multi-authored papers with lots of people's data in them, sometimes the Muriqi's data can't be in there, and it's not because we don't want to, it's because we don't have large enough sample sizes because rates of agonistic interactions are so low. Or even some of these subtle displacement things are just so low. Now, you asked me another question about the ecological drivers, and you know, I don't know. I would love it if someone could explain that to me. So, you know, we come into a system and we see that animals have really good behavioral avoidance mechanisms. We know from non-invasive hormonal analysis, male testosterone levels and cortisol levels are really low. We don't see signs of, we don't see signs of that you see in other hierarchical, more aggressive male primates. The sexual monomorphism should help. The fact that there's not an obvious power struggle, obvious physical advantages, but why in the beginning? Well, maybe we have animals that are as large as they can be to be as mobile as they are. And I think that there are energetic models of arboreal primates. You know, orangutans are obviously bigger, but they're not as mobile. They're not as rapidly locomoting. Muriqis are about the same size as gibbons, and they have similar similar locomotor systems. And so there may be some limits to body size. And I don't think there are some Amazonian woolly monkey males that are bigger, but if females are setting the limit, because you've got to have your female plus a baby that she's carrying, that's the body size limit. So ultimately, not just the adults, but you know, a mother carrying a baby, it has to be the body size limits. Why their canines are similar in size could reflect this feedback selection on them balancing selection between male and females, but honestly, it's really hard to say. I don't know. Oh, and then males have giant testes, so that's another thing. They're competing by sperm competition.
Thank you very much.
You're on mute, Eduardo.
So before we take the, thank you. Before we take the last question, which is going to take us to Germany, I'll use that as an entry for announcing our next talk on Tuesday, which is also going to come from Germany. Peter Kappeler will be presenting. So Julia, you're given the privilege of asking the last question. And after that, we need to let Karen know. I'm not calling on David because I know that David reminded me that he's meeting with Karen later, so he can ask the questions then. So, and then we need to let Karen go to some of the other meetings she has. Julia.
Yeah, okay, I'll make this brief. So first of all, yeah, Julia Fischer here from Göttingen, from German Primate Center, the Cognitive Pathology Lab. Thank you for this really interesting talk. I very much enjoyed the apparent convergences between the guinea baboons and the Muriqis in terms of the lack of competition that all rang a bell. But my only point really was it's more of an encouragement. I think it would be great if we could all pay a little bit more attention to what you alluded to, the difference in habituation, degrees of habituation between the group, how this affects our impression of what is going on between the groups. Because from our experience with the guinea baboons, when we started to habituate them, we thought that they were actually quite separate at a certain level, at the gang level. But that was only really because the neighboring groups were still not habituated to us. And since they became also habituated to us, it has become a mess to follow them. But we also see that there's much more traffic between between the groups. And taking that into account, I think when you start collecting your comparative data, I think it would be lovely if we could also include this kind of information in our long-term records.
That's a really, that we definitely, you know, I'm pretty confident of our assessment of groups, but we have now had 3 group fissions, you know, new groups, daughter groups. And the last one, the first one, just suddenly animals that we knew weren't from the main group started appearing in this whole place. And so that one was vague. We understood that in a retrospective analysis because I had a postdoc, Jean-Philippe Boubli, who was studying one of the other groups. Exactly, his team was there exactly when that group started fissioning in 2002. You know, we caught that again, the males moving. In fact, we couldn't get the paper published because we kept seeing this group of 8 males, and we called it the male unit. And the reviewer saying, "But they're not a unit; they're part of a group because they were in the network analysis." Anyway, it was exactly what you're talking about, exactly. But then, even in 2013. I only can say 2013 because my main study group fissioned more recently, and it was a very gradual process where I stopped talking about how big that group got because I'm not sure yet when I can say it's a new group or part of the same group when these 20 animals formed their own group, their 5th group. So I think you're absolutely right about that. The role of habituation has been, you know, it's weighing that thing. I mean, that was a big idea. It was amazing to me that we were able to get funding from the National Science Foundation to put camera traps out to see whether the Muriqis, you know, come to the ground when we're not there, because it seemed like such a case where if they didn't do it, we would have nothing to say, but they did, so we could say something. But that was actually intended to see how much our influence on them might have been either keeping the other groups in the trees or not. But there is this second layer, which I think your point is absolutely valid about how we actually see what we see from the animals. And then in my interest is layered onto that is thinking about, is it let's not try to over habituate these other groups, especially the ones that are living more distant from where our house is, where we have more monitoring, you know, where we know that intruders aren't coming into the forest, you know, I just don't want to make them too vulnerable. So I think that is a real factor as well on the potential of superhabituation. This is a really good point. Thank you.
Well,
I love your work, by the way. I like that. I love that Guinea stuff. I've been reading a lot of it too, because it's so relevant, like you said.
So with that, I'd like to thank Karen again for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for joining us, and looking forward to seeing you again next Tuesday. Karen needs to go, so she can do that as whenever you want to do that, Karen. Those of you who want to hang out a little bit longer, that's like sometimes it happens. I may need to go soon, but I can make anyone host, and you guys can keep talking if there are other things that we'd like to discuss. Thank you, Karen, so much.
Can I just ask you? So I log out of this one, and then I log into that David Woods thing for those private meetings?
Yes, David will take it from here.
Okay, well, can I just thank everybody for coming despite the time limits or the time confusion, and also for these great questions, which is always, I love these kinds of questions because I've been taking notes because they stimulate me to think about new things, and that's really good. And also thank you very much, Eduardo, for hosting this and just for everything, for making this happen. I really appreciate it. So I'll go now. Thank you, everybody, and hope to hear more soon.
Bye.
Bye.
So Lauren, Karsten, or those of you who want to hang out, I don't know if you have any other things that you want to mention. I see people
I need
just
to
left with 14 of us. I need to be going soon as well.
I'll need to go too soon.
Yeah. So, well, then I guess that today we're calling it a day now.
Okay.
I thank you all, and I'll be seeing you next Tuesday.
Thanks, Eduardo.
Bye, guys.
Okay, see you then.